the high priest Caiaphas, and he's the man that, according to the Gospels, is partially responsible for sending Jesus to the cross.
The high priest Caiaphas played a pivotal role in the trial and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He had actions and words that guided God to the painful end of having to carry the cross and be crucified on the cross. But from the moment he suddenly uttered a sentence while accusing God, everyone in the world suddenly became quiet, because they realized that things happen that are not random. It is not natural that Caiaphas forced Jesus into such a path of suffering. It's all part of the plan in your hands, and the real implications behind Caiaphas's words can shock the whole world and completely destroy your previous understanding. Caiaphas, the high priest. Joseph Caiaphas was the Jewish high priest during the time of Jesus' ministry and a few years afterward. He was a strong opponent of Jesus and his message. Caiaphas was concerned that Jesus' popularity could provoke the Romans and threaten his own position of authority. When he saw crowds cheering for Jesus as he entered Jerusalem, Caiaphas felt compelled to take action. He initiated the events that led to the trial and execution of Jesus, a figure many still believe to be the Son of God. Caiaphas was the son-in-law of Annas, the former high priest. Caiaphas was also a member of one of the ruling Jewish sects, the Sadducees. Sadducees were often wealthy men of high position, and as they sought to appease their Roman rulers, were heavily involved in politics. They held the majority seat in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court, over which Caiaphas ruled for the 18 years he served as high priest. After Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees met at Caiaphas' palace to express their concern that Jesus' growing number of followers would incite the anger of the Roman Empire. They were unsure how to proceed until Caiaphas spoke. "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." This statement calling for Jesus' death was a cold, calculating move of political expediency. At the same time, Caiaphas was unknowingly prophesying about God's plan for Jesus' death. Through the Sanhedrin's wicked actions, God would save both the Jewish nation and anyone else who would believe in Christ. When the Jewish leaders had Jesus arrested at Passover, they first brought him before Annas. After he had questioned Jesus, Annas sent Jesus to his son-in-law Caiaphas, who as the high priest would be the one to rule on Jesus' fate. When Jesus stood before Caiaphas and the entire Sanhedrin, many false witnesses were brought forward, but nothing was found to warrant a death sentence. Finally, Caiaphas stood up and addressed Jesus directly. "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus replied just as directly, "You have said so, but I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Caiaphas had what he was looking for. The result of the sham trial was that Jesus was pronounced worthy of death and beaten and mocked. However, since the Jews could not legally execute prisoners, Caiaphas sent Jesus to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Jesus endured another series of trials that night under Roman jurisdiction. Caiaphas and the other religious leaders stirred up the crowd against Jesus. Then, our Jesus was sentenced to die, beaten, led outside the city, and crucified. It's what Caiaphas wanted all along. The unintentional prophet. Even after seeing the miracle of Lazarus restored to life, the high priest Caiaphas refused to believe Jesus was the Messiah and was more firmly resolved than ever to have him put to death. He used the excuse that Jesus might cause the Romans to destroy the Jews' religious system, so he said, "It is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not." Like Balaam, forced to prophesy what he did not intend, Caiaphas was made to predict the true significance of Christ's coming death. Instead of his death being expedient for us, for Caiaphas and his system, It was indeed expedient that one man should die for the people. This is a remarkable divine irony. Caiaphas, the chief religious representative of God to the people of Israel, should have known the Old Testament prophecies and gladly welcomed Jesus as the promised Messiah. Instead, he organized his trial and condemnation. Yet he was divinely inspired, without knowing or intending it, to point out the real mission of Christ to the Jews and the whole world, that of substitutionary sacrifice for their sins. It is also interesting that in 1992, the bones of this same Caiaphas were discovered in a tomb underneath the modern city. So far as we know, Caiaphas died still rejecting Christ. Nevertheless, following Christ's substitutionary death, the evidence for his glorious resurrection, eternal, not temporary like that of Lazarus, became so clear and compelling that a great company of the priests were obedient to the faith. Caiaphas did indeed manage to get Jesus crucified, but the result was salvation for multitudes. Caiaphas indeed prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation. Apostle John also offers an explanation how Caiaphas, a wicked man, was able to utter these prophetic words about Jesus, implying that Caiaphas did not actually speak these words of his own volition. And this spake he not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied. What then did Caiaphas intend? As discussed above, the setting indicates that Caiaphas and the other members of the Sanhedrin were primarily concerned about the possibility of a riot as a result of Jesus' ever-increasing popularity, as well as his potentially volatile teachings against the Jewish leaders. A riot might cause the Romans to shut down the temple, which could negatively affect Jews all across the Roman Empire. The reasoning of the council concerning the situation was, if we leave him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. In response, Caiaphas exclaimed, Ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us, that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. Caiaphas was concerned with political expediency, not with justice. If the death of one potential troublemaker avoided the wrath of the Roman army upon the temple and the Jewish people, it was a necessary evil. Further, because Caiaphas was the high priest, the loss of the temple, a very profitable enterprise because of the constant receipt of tithes and offerings, would have been financially devastating to him and many other members of the Sadducee-dominated Sanhedrin. Caiaphas's own words reveal his true intent: to save himself from political and financial ruin. Caiaphas is another reason Yeshua came to the earth, not only to become the final atonement for the sins of all people, but to expose the self-righteous Pharisees and Sadducees who were ruling the Jews with fear and condemnation. He was a part of the brood of vipers Yeshua warned the people about. Then yet Yeshua prays on the cross, Father, please forgive them, for they know not what they do. Yeshua even died for Caiaphas's sins as well. Thank you, Yeshua, for our Father's grace, mercy, and love. Theory of the resurrection of Jesus. We all know that Jesus rose from the dead on the third day after his crucifixion. But there is a weird theory about his resurrection. A few days after the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, the report of his resurrection from the dead became so common because the excitement was more intense than before, and Caiaphas's own life, as well as that of Pilate, was in danger. Almost all who met Jesus were convinced that Jesus was resurrected by supernatural power and was still living, and that he was no human being, for the light and the angels and the dead that came out of their graves all went to prove that something had happened that never occurred on earth before. Mary says that when they went, day was just breaking. They met the soldiers returning from the sepulchre and saw nothing strange until they came to the tomb and found it empty. The stone that covered the sepulchre was rolled to one side, and two men dressed in flowing white were sitting, one at each end of the sepulchre. Mary asked them where her Lord was. They said, "He is risen from the dead. Did he not tell you he would rise the third day and show himself to the people, to prove that he was the Lord of life?" "Go tell his disciples," said they. Joanna said she saw but one man, but this discrepancy must have been due to their excitement, because they say they were much alarmed. They both say that as they returned, they met the Master, who told them that he was the resurrection and the life. All that will accept shall be resurrected from the second death. We fell at his feet, all bathed in tears, and when we rose up, he was gone. It was Caiaphas who influenced the resurrection of Jesus. Caiaphas engineered the crucifixion, which engineers a resurrection. First fearing continued disorder, Caiaphas secured a tomb with guards so it wouldn't become a pilgrimage site. Next, he removed the body, bribing the guards to say the disciples stole it if anybody asked. Then Caiaphas planted a young man or young men to confront the woman or anybody else who came by. Frequently interpreted as an angle, the stranger in the tomb was very likely a junior temple priest dazzling. In the white linen robe junior priests wore, they were to tell the women to tell the disciples that Jesus was raised, and he would go ahead of them and meet them in Galilee. From this ruse, the disciples, gullible as they were, really just a bunch of Galilean hillbillies, were expected to skedaddle to the hill country seeking their elusive Lord, now gone and soon to be forgotten in Jerusalem. Once they were Galilee, it can hardly have mattered to Caiaphas what they believed about Jesus. Point being, they wouldn't be in Jerusalem stirring up trouble. Caiaphas's reputation with the Romans for keeping order would be intact, and there would be no need for further brutality. With the disciples schlepping aimlessly all over Galilee, Jerusalem could get back to normal. What in fact happened to the body was irrelevant. Stolen or mislaid, it didn't matter. So long as everyone was looking in Galilee and not in Jerusalem, pestering the good folks at the temple. Of course, this is a completely untrue theory, and you should only listen to know that such a theory still exists in the world. Don't worry too much about it. You just need to remember that God died for man's sins, and on the third day, he rose again. The high priest behind Jesus' rushed and rigged trial. Custom dictated that after the temple guards arrested Jesus, he should have been locked up in the temple stockade until such time that the full Sanhedrin, or priestly council, could hear his case. This is exactly what happened to Peter, John, and other apostles upon their arrest. But instead, Jesus was taken directly to the Jerusalem residence of the high priest, Joseph Caiaphas. This was highly unusual for a number of reasons. First, it was the eve of Passover, one of the holiest nights on the Jewish liturgical calendar, when the high priest and other priestly officials would be expected to celebrate the festival with their families, rather than adjudicating the case of a rural rabbi from Galilee. Second, while Caiaphas' residence was probably quite comfortable, if not luxurious, it was unlikely that his home would have been large enough to accommodate the full quorum of 72 members on the Sanhedrin, even assuming that these members would have allowed themselves to be summoned on such short notice. The hastily organized indictment of Jesus, as described in Mark's account, which would form the basis for all subsequent Gospels, was conducted under cloak of darkness, which suggests that Caiaphas was eager to dispense with Jesus as soon as possible, and to do so behind closed doors without the full Sanhedrin present. John states that Jesus was first questioned by Annas, Caiaphas' father-in-law, who had previously served as high priest, and as head of the Annas family was probably considered a leading authority on religious matters. Following a brief hearing, Jesus was then referred to Caiaphas. At that moment, Caiaphas had served some 12 years in office, having succeeded his brother-in-law Eleazar ben Ananus, one of Annas' 5 sons, to become high priest. Caiaphas was facing a difficult situation. Without the full backing of the Sanhedrin, a high priest did not have the power to order a man's death single-handedly. His only other option was to refer the whole matter to the local Roman government. This would be a very controversial move because Over the preceding decades, the Sanhedrin had fought hard to retain its autonomy in domestic matters without any interference from the Roman authorities. The other and even more fundamental problem was that Jesus was only guilty of disturbing the peace and perhaps of blasphemy in the temple forecourt, but neither of these warranted Roman intervention, let alone a sentence of death. To make matters worse, the indictment hearing as described by Mark did not go according to plan. The various eyewitnesses did not agree. "We heard him say," said one, "I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands." Mark 14:58. It warning that the Jerusalem temple would face imminent destruction. Caiaphas then tried a different tack and asked Jesus flat out, "Are you the Messiah?" Jesus replied, "I am," and then cited from the book of Daniel and the Psalms, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." This is what Caiaphas needed to hear. He knew that the Romans had no interest in the minutiae of Jewish exegesis, but words like the right hand of the power would get their attention. The high priest tore his clothes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses?" In his view, Jesus had incriminated himself. Inner portrait of Israel's high priest. The city of gold, Jerusalem, had not fully lifted herself from slumber. Some industrious shopkeepers were just beginning to set up their wares in the bazaar. The pungent odor from the fishmonger's booth seeped heavily into the dawn. The silhouette of a man stepped down from the awesome structure of the temple and followed a secluded path that led to his home. The steps were heavy. It was the 3rd day since the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. His disciples were gone, dispersed as by a strong wind. Still, Caiaphas was rattled with uneasiness. The imperial government might still be dissatisfied with his handling of the situation. For some time now, Rome had been casting a wary eye upon Palestine. The activities of the rebellious zealots had already pricked their pride. Reliable sources had warned that Rome would be intolerant of petty antics within the Jewish state. One major uprising, and Rome would march. The temple in all of its splendor and his position within the Jewish hierarchy would vanish. Caiaphas had been concerned since the proclamation of John the Baptist. The proclamation that Jesus of Nazareth was the long-awaited Messiah and deliverer of Israel. Annas had convinced his son-in-law that many false messiahs had indeed come and gone. Why the alarm over Jesus? Given time, he too would pass from the scene, in death or disgrace. Jesus was not the popular hero that had been expected, yet multitudes were drawn magnetically. He didn't fit the description of the scribes who portrayed the Messiah as a great human deliverer who would overthrow the Gentile powers. Jesus came as a teacher, couched in humility, not at all self-seeking. He gathered to himself a mere 12 disciples, students who beheld him as their rabbi. He was a man of great compassion and appealed readily to those Jews who were poor and disabled, the uneducated, along with the social misfits. They found in him an acceptance quite apart from the reception normally given them by the Pharisees. They felt a genuine freedom from the stringent requirements of the law, which seemed virtually impossible to keep. Caiaphas had listened cautiously to reports which filtered in from time to time. Any attempt at usurping the power of the Sanhedrin would be dealt with swiftly. During his 3 years of public ministry, Jesus traveled to every city, village, and hamlet. During those years, he had repeatedly disobeyed the teachings of the rabbis concerning the Sabbath. He had refused to perform the ritual cleansing of the foods that he and his disciples ate and would attack the Jewish leaders vehemently when they would question him concerning these matters. His teachings were founded on the word of God, not on the words of the rabbis. He claimed, he came not to destroy the law but to fulfill it. Caiaphas had become personally involved when Jesus took it upon himself to cleanse the temple by the overthrowing of its many business concessions. Annas was incensed, for he profited from such temple business. He made known to Caiaphas his displeasure and advised that Jesus be publicly discredited. After all, he was misleading the people, and his claims of being God in the flesh were blasphemous. Caiaphas thus instructed the scribes and Pharisees to follow and challenge him whenever and wherever he ministered. He left the doctors of the law dumbfounded. They would walk away only able to shake their heads. It seemed as though there was not a passage in the entire scripture that he did not know. Devastating were the blows of defection from within his own ranks. Caiaphas learned of Nicodemus and his visit by night to Jesus. He would not escape scandal. Disquieting were the many reports by the leading Pharisees and priests who had witnessed the miracles of Jesus and could not deny them. This was no ordinary faker or soothsayer. They would wander back to the temple, commenting amongst themselves how Jesus spoke with the authority of Moses and the speech of David. Indeed, several lost their nerve on the occasion when Jesus quoted David and likened himself to the stone, which the builders rejected, who would become the cornerstone. Finally, there were the rabbis and teachers who had witnessed the raising from the dead him who was called Lazarus of Bethany. Caiaphas had looked at them with disdain. With calmness and evenness of tone, he had explained that Jesus must die that the nation might live. All had been put on alert to watch for Jesus. The Passover was drawing near, and no precautions could be spared. At first, his disciples remained in seclusion. However, it became common knowledge that Jesus would come to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. As the crowds passionately waved their palms and shouted, "Hosanna," which means, "Lord, deliver us now. Blessed is the King of Israel, that cometh in the name of the Lord," deep frustration growled within Caiaphas. The people of the land were cursed because they knew not the law. Their blatant ignorance and acceptance of Jesus festered within him. His mind raced back to the Feast of Tabernacles. The appearance of Jesus had marred the proceedings on the last day of that feast. He stood in the midst of the temple and proclaimed that those who believed on him would have living water flowing from their hearts. Apparently, even the officers of the temple had been mesmerized by Jesus' magnetism. Caiaphas had allowed the Pharisees to deal with the situation as they were acquainted with the intricacies of oral tradition. He had been confident that they would have an answer. "Are ye also deceived?" goaded the Pharisees. "Have any of the rulers or of the Pharisees believed on him?" The logic was impotent, and Caiaphas knew it. The betrayal and arrest of Jesus afforded only a brief respite for the high priest. Judas never came forth to testify at the trial. Witnesses contradicted one another in their accounts, thus violating God's word. It was stipulated that 2 or more witnesses must be in agreement. Jesus remained silent as charges were repeatedly hurled at him by members of the council. Solemnly, Caiaphas had stood and adjured him by the living God to tell the council if indeed he were the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus assented. The poll was only a formality. The conviction and pronouncement of the death sentence were bittersweet for Caiaphas. He and the elders of the Sanhedrin had to appear before Pilate to vie for the implementation of their sentence. Pilate had used Jesus as a pawn in taunting them, in challenging the judgment they had rendered. Only when they had enlarged the charge to one of treason against the state, against Caesar, Emperor of Rome, did he concede. The ugliness of the crucifixion and the naked, tortured body were now only a haunting memory. Caiaphas was still plagued. Still, there was an air of desperation enveloping the high priest. The massive veil in the temple had been rent from the top to the bottom. Explanations did not even provide hollow relief. The tomb was now sealed by Roman hands and guarded by Roman soldiers along with the temple guard. Caiaphas could only wait. The final day must pass, the final proof that Jesus was not who he said he was. His mortality and inability to conquer death after 3 days in the grave would be vindication for Caiaphas. The clatter, the voices pitched with excitement. They were in the courtyard now. They were calling his name. "Caiaphas!" they cried. his face flushed crimson as the temple watch fearfully reported their encounter with the angel of the Lord and the empty tomb. What would they say? What explanation would be given to the Jewish people? Hurried counsel with the elders produced the official account. His disciples had come by night and stolen the body while the watch slept. As a Sadducee, Caiaphas would have viewed the scriptures with cold legality. He would have rejected the teaching of life after death and dismissed bodily resurrection and the presence of angelic beings with scornful logic. No doubt the very roots of his orthodoxy were shaken by these events climaxing in Jesus' resurrection. Pride of the heart and a fear of losing power perhaps were the key factors as to why Caiaphas publicly rejected Christ and his claims. How reality must have haunted him during the remainder of his tenure as high priest, and for the rest of his life. We don't know what ultimately became of Caiaphas. Whether he turned to the Lord and put his faith and trust in him remains undisclosed. The scriptures are silent on this matter. We know that Caiaphas was confronted with the proof that the Savior was alive. He was indeed God in the flesh and had conquered death, as he said he would. This is history, life-giving, documented history. It's important to note that God crucified did not happen at the whim of Caiaphas, the priests or Pilate, for it was all part of God's plan to save the world through the death of his Son. As Jesus had said, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." 3 days later, Jesus rose again from the grave, fulfilling prophecy, defeating death, and emboldening his followers to share the good news of salvation with thousands throughout the known world.